The morning the livestock dealer came to see about buying her out, he found Clara Marsh standing in 6 inches of snow with a feed bucket in each hand and 112 hogs at her back, all of them fat. Not winter thin, not ribby under their bristles, the way hogs got in February when the hay ran short and a farmer's arithmetic turned desperate, but genuinely, roundly fat. The kind of fat that meant something had gone exactly right when everything in Cass County, Nebraska said it couldn't. The dealer, a man named Rourke who wore his prosperity in the gold buttons of his coat and the easy way he stood on other people's ground, had ridden out expecting to buy a distressed herd at a distressed price. He had heard, everyone had heard, that Clara Marsh had wintered her animals on spoiled pumpkins. He had come prepared to feel sorry for her and to profit from the feeling. What he found instead stopped him at the gate. He looked at the hogs. He looked at Clara. He looked at the hogs again. She set her buckets down in the snow and said, patient as the cold was patient, "I already have a buyer in Omaha, Mr. Rourke. I wrote to him in November." He smiled at her the way a man smiles when he is recalculating, and left the way he came. 3 seasons earlier, Cass County had watched Clara Marsh do the most sensible-seeming foolish thing a young woman alone had ever done on its roads. 3 seasons earlier. Her nearest neighbor was an old Czech farmer named Horolek, who had been growing rye on the ridge above the Platte River since before Clara was born. He was 71, small as a dried corn cob, and he had the habit of speaking truth the way other men had the habit of breathing, without ceremony and without mercy. The first morning he saw Clara unloading the pumpkins from borrowed wagons onto her yard, he walked down from his ridge and stood at her fence and watched for a full 3 minutes before he said anything. Then he said, "The land gives the thing it wants to give, not the thing you wish it would." Clara said she didn't follow him. He nodded at the field behind her, 40 acres of pale clay soil that had grown 4 crops in 10 years and yielded badly at each one. "The land does not want wheat," he said. "Maybe it wants to teach you something else." Then he walked back up to his ridge without explaining what he meant, and Clara stood in the pale September light, looking at 4,700 frost-soft pumpkins heaped against her fence like a disaster that had happened to someone else. She had bought them for $10. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was what made the town laugh. $10 to Jacob Foote of the Foote Brothers farm stand operation 8 miles east, who had grown a field of sugar pumpkins and pie pumpkins and a sprawling variety, the seed catalog called Hubbard Squash Keepers, that had ripened beautifully and then sat unsold at his roadside wagon through the first 3 weeks of September until the nights turned hard and the frost hit twice in 4 days and softened the skins past selling. The frost had not reached the flesh deep enough to rot the whole of them, not yet, but it had blemished the skin and collapsed the stems, and Foote could not move them at market price. He wanted them gone before they turned to slick orange mud in his field. He had been on the edge of plowing them under when Clara Marsh appeared at his fence with 10 silver dollars in a flour sack and an offer to haul them herself. Foote took the money before she finished the sentence. What Clara knew, and what nobody else in Cass County paused long enough to consider, was that a frost-soft pumpkin was not a ruined thing. It was only a ruined thing for selling. The sugar had concentrated where the cold had pressed it, the same way a late apple sweetens on the branch after the first frost, and the flesh was still dense and pale and good. She knew this because she had spent 2 Octobers working on a hog operation in Iowa before her father's illness brought her back to Nebraska, and she had watched those Iowa farmers cart damaged squash and culled pumpkins to their hog lots and seen what well-fed October hogs looked like by December. She had filed that observation away in the careful cabinet of her mind, where she kept things that might someday matter, and now it mattered. She had $400 saved from the Iowa wages and from 2 years of careful life on her father's land, and she meant to spend 390 of it on 9 weanling pigs from the auction in Louisville, Nebraska in late September, and to run them all winter on damaged produce and whatever forage she could arrange, and to have a marketable herd by the following February. The 9 pigs cost her $346.32 after the hauling. She put them in the lot her father had built along the south wall of the barn where the building cut the north wind, and she fed them the first pumpkins that week. She cut them open with a hand axe, splitting each one to expose the wet orange interior, and the pigs hit them the way pigs hit anything sweet, with the whole of themselves, snorting and crowding and pressing each other aside with their shoulders. She watched them eat. She noted the quality of it, and then she went inside and wrote down the weight of each animal in the small ledger she kept on the shelf above the stove. By the 1st of October, she had hauled all 4,700 pumpkins to her lot in 6 borrowed wagon loads, borrowing the wagons from Horelek, who lent them without comment but charged her 50 cents per wagon per load, which she paid. She stacked the ones she could not immediately feed in long rows against the windward fence, covering them with the old canvas tarps she had found folded in her father's barn. She understood she was buying time. The covered pumpkins would hold through October and into November if the weather was not too wet. After that, she would need to be feeding them steadily to stay ahead of the rot. And she had done the arithmetic. 4,700 pumpkins, 9 pigs, approximately 30 pounds of pumpkin per pig per day, mixed with the dry corn she had bought in August at the season low. She had enough, just enough. The margin made her stomach tight when she looked at it on paper, but it was there. The town's opinion arrived quickly, as a small town's opinion always does, and it arrived in the particular form that small-town opinion takes when it wants to sound like concern. Ida Prewitt, whose husband ran the feed and hardware on the main road, stopped Clara outside the post office in the first week of October and told her, with her head tilted and her voice lowered, in the way that means the speaker is enjoying themselves, that her husband believed those pumpkins would go to mold before Thanksgiving and leave her animals short. Harold Buell, who farmed 300 acres of corn to the south and liked to let you know it, told her at the grain elevator that a single woman running hogs through a Nebraska winter was a thing he had never seen go right. He was very sorry to say it, he said, and he was not sorry at all. And young men loading wagons at the co-op laughed when they thought she could not hear them, saying Marcia's Pumpkin Palace and asking each other in loud voices whether she'd be selling pie at the gate come November. Clara heard all of it. Being right is its own kind of reply, and so she said nothing and went home and worked. She was 24 years old, and she had been left a farm that the county assessor had valued at less than the cost of the fencing around it. She had a barn with a good roof and a bad floor, a south-facing lot with thick plank walls, 9 growing pigs, 4,700 frost-soft pumpkins, a winter coming hard down from the north, and $6.50 remaining in the account at the Weeping Water Bank. She did not have the luxury of despair, and so she did not despair. She adjusted. The work was what it was, and what it was constant. She rose before light every morning from the beginning of October through the end of February, and she worked until it was dark. And then she worked a little longer by lantern in the barn, and those 4 months compressed later in her memory not into a series of events, but into a single long texture of cold air and split pumpkin and the particular steam that rose from hog breath in the November dark. She learned the animals the way you learn people you live with, their individual tempers and preferences, which ones pushed to the front of the lot and which ones waited at the edges and needed to be given a clear path to the food or they would not eat enough. She learned the lot itself, where the drainage ran poor and needed extra bedding hauled, where the wind found a crack in the plank wall and hit a specific corner, where the animals huddled too tightly and wasted body heat pressing against each other instead of eating. She nailed a length of board over the crack. She rerouted the drainage with a trench she dug herself on her knees in the October mud with a short-handled spade over the course of 3 long afternoons. Small fixes, unglamorous ones. But she had noticed long ago that small and unglamorous fixes, reliably made, were the mechanism by which farms either survived or did not. Horlick came down the ridge on a Tuesday in late October to borrow back one of his tarps. He found her deep in the pumpkin rows, sorting the ones that had begun to soften too fast on their undersides from the ones that were still holding firm, setting aside the compromised ones to feed first and recovering the good ones under the canvas. He stood and watched her work for a while. Then he said, "You rotate them like a root cellar," and she said yes. Same principle. He nodded slowly. He picked up one of the soft ones she had set aside and turned it in his rough hands, assessing it the way old men assess things they know well. "Still sweet," he said. She said yes. He set it back and retrieved his tarp and walked back up to his ridge, and Clara went on sorting in the thin October light with mud on her knees and pumpkin juice on her sleeves, and something that was not quite happiness and not quite relief, but was in the country between them moving quietly inside her chest. November arrived the way November arrives in Nebraska, without transition, one afternoon cold and the next one bitter, the sky the color of an old iron pot, the Platte going gray-green and low. Clara had been feeding the herd steadily for 6 weeks, and the difference in her 9 animals was impossible not to see. They had put on weight at a rate that continued to strike her as almost improbable, though she had looked at the ledger numbers twice a week and watched it happen in careful increments and knew it was entirely real. The sugar in the frost-touched pumpkins was doing what she had reasoned it would do, and the fat was building on those animals the way fat builds when animals eat well and rest warm and are not burning their feed against the cold because their shelter is genuinely adequate rather than approximately adequate. She had, in the dry, ungenerous language of the ledger, a functioning operation. She told no one. She kept it banked low under ash. The way you keep a coal you are not sure you have the fuel to sustain. There would be time to let the world see it when there was enough of it to show. What she did do in November was write the letter to Omaha. She had gotten the name from a notice in the Weeping Water paper, a pork broker named Alderman who was expanding his operation and looking for Nebraska producers who could deliver winter hogs. She wrote him a plain letter that said she expected to have a herd ready in late February, that she was targeting an average finished weight of 250 pounds, and that she had reason to believe her animals would come through the winter in better condition than the county average. She did not say why she believed this. She did not mention the pumpkins. She folded the letter and addressed it and walked it to the post office herself and came home and went back to work and did not wait for the answer because waiting was not something the farm allowed. Alderman wrote back in 2 weeks. He was cautiously interested. He would need to know the count and the condition by January. She wrote back and told him the count was 9 animals currently, and she believed she could run them to 10 or 11 by February if she acquired additional weanlings before December. He wrote back and said he dealt in herd lots and that 9 or 11 animals was below his usual minimum. She wrote back and said she understood and that she would need another year to reach the scale he required, and asked if he was willing to discuss terms for a commitment on a larger delivery the following season, contingent on his assessing her February animals for quality. There was a pause of 3 weeks. Then Alderman wrote and said he would send a man in February to look at what she had. By December she had 10 hogs. She had bought the 10th from a farmer on the South Road named Westerfield, who was selling down his animals because the corn crop had been short and he could not afford the winter feed. Westerfield sold her the animal at half what it was worth because he needed the cash and because he did not believe she would be able to do anything useful with it anyway. A single woman in winter running on pumpkins of all things. He said the pumpkins part with the light, dismissive air of a man repeating something funny someone else had said, which was exactly what he was doing. She brought the new animal home in the back of Horilek's borrowed cart and introduced it to the lot with the standard caution, a separate pen inside the barn for 4 days to confirm it was healthy, watching it eat and move, and watching its eyes, before she let it in with the main group. It was a good animal. She noted this in the ledger. She was not surprised. Westerfield had kept decent stock. It was his grain supply that had failed him, not his judgment about animals. She ran the new arithmetic: 10 hogs at target 250 pounds, which at the rates Alderman had quoted in his letter would represent a return of, she worked it out on the margin of the ledger page, checking the figure twice, something close to $460 above her cost of acquisition, assuming the hogs came in at weight and condition, against an outlay of $396.50 in pigs, pumpkins, corn, bedding, and borrowed wagon fees. That left her with a profit of more than $60, which would be the first profit this farm had produced in 3 years, and she sat at the stove with that piece of arithmetic for a long time before she went to bed. December was cold. It was the kind of cold that finds the places where you were almost thorough and reminds you. A plank in the lot wall split at a nail and needed 3 hours of repair in wind. The water trough froze every night and needed breaking every morning before feeding. 2 of the pumpkin rows at the windward end of the yard, the ones she had thought were covered well enough, had taken more freeze than she had anticipated, and she lost perhaps 200 pumpkins to a blackened, slick rot that spread overnight and contaminated the ones stacked nearest. She pulled the bad ones herself, hauling them in a barrow to the far end of the field and burying them before they could contaminate further. She recalculated the feed supply. She was still inside the margin. Just. The corn she had bought in August would carry the difference. She had known she might need it as a buffer, and she had bought it with exactly that in mind. And now the foresight repaid her, and she allowed herself to note this in the ledger with a plain satisfaction that was as close as she came that month to celebration. The hard January came, the kind that Cass County spoke of later as a specific thing, the January of 1887, when the temperature at Weeping Water fell to 19 below and held there for 11 days without relief, and the Platte froze bank to bank, and at least 2 farms on the South Road lost livestock in numbers that ruined them. Westerfield, who had sold Clara the 10th hog for half price in December because he didn't believe she could manage, lost 4 of his remaining 6 pigs to cold in the second week of January, when his barn roof gave under the snow load and left a section of his lot open to the sky. Harold Buell, who farmed his 300 corn acres to the south, and had told Clara at the grain elevator that a single woman running hogs through a Nebraska winter was a thing he had never seen go right, had a terrible January as well. His stored grain supply had gone into an unventilated corner of a crib that trapped condensation, and the result was a mold loss that would haunt his books until spring. He did not mention it in public, but it was the kind of news that traveled anyway. Clara's barn held, the good roof, the south-facing lot, the board nailed over the wind crack, the trench she had cut on her knees in October mud. They all held. Her animals came through the worst 11 days of the year without loss, eating their pumpkins and corn from a trough she had mounted inside the barn shelter to keep the feed from freezing solid in the lot, a modification she had made in late November based on nothing more sophisticated than the observation that cold pumpkin eaten in cold wind costs an animal more warmth than cold pumpkin eaten in shelter, and warmth was what she was trying to preserve. She checked each animal morning and evening through the deep cold, and she brought extra bedding, and she burned a low lamp in the barn through the coldest nights, not for the warmth it gave, which was minimal, but for the check it required her to make every few hours, which meant she caught a small thing early on the 4th night, one of the younger animals holding itself slightly apart and pressing a shoulder against the wall in a way that meant it was not feeling right. And she addressed it before it became a large thing, and the animal was fine by morning. By the third week of January, when the cold finally broke and the temperature climbed back above zero, and the county came out of its houses to assess the damage, Clara Marsh's herd was 10 animals strong, and every one of them was fat. The arithmetic of that word, in that January, in that county, was not lost on her. Horlick came down the ridge the day after the temperature broke. He walked along the outside of her lot fence and looked at each animal with his old Czech farmer's careful eyes, and then he stood at the fence for a while in the thin winter sunlight saying nothing, which from Horlick was the highest form of approval. Then he said, "The land gave you the thing it wanted to give, and you were wise enough to take it." Clara thought this was the finest thing anyone had said to her in several years, and she did not say so, but she thought it. She made him tea, and they drank it in her kitchen without saying much, and then he went back up to his ridge. Alderman's man came in the first week of February. His name was Levins, a compact, quick-eyed man from Omaha, who arrived by the afternoon stage and drove out to the farm in a rented buggy with the specific air of a man who had been to many farms and expected to see the usual. He stood at the lot fence and looked at 10 hogs, each one approaching or exceeding 240 pounds, moving well, bright-eyed, no signs of the winter attrition that was normal in Nebraska February herds. He walked the fence twice. He asked Clara what she had fed them. She told him. He asked her to repeat the pumpkin part, and she did. He crouched down at the fence rail and looked at one of the larger animals for a long time, assessing it the way Horlick had assessed the pumpkin in October, with the focused, private attention of someone who knows the thing well. Then he stood up and said he would wire Alderman from town that afternoon. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, though she had not seen it applied to herself before. It was the look of a man revising his categories. She met it without fuss and offered him coffee before he drove back, and he accepted it, and they sat at her table and talked about prices, and he named a figure and she named a figure higher, and they settled on a figure between them that was, when she wrote it in the ledger that evening, the largest single number that ledger had ever held. Rourke came 2 weeks after Levins. He had heard through the particular acoustic of a small county in winter that the Omaha broker's man had visited the Marsh place and left satisfied, and he had put his own arithmetic together and come to the conclusion that there might be money to be made in her herd before Alderman's people arrived to collect it. He rode in on a gray morning with his gold coat buttons and his easy manner and looked at the hogs, and then looked at Clara, and then looked at the hogs again, and offered to take the lot off her hands at a price he described as generous. Clara picked up her 2 feed buckets and said she already had a buyer in Omaha, Mr. Rourke, and she had written to him in November. The timing of that, November, landed on Rourke's face in a way that was visible. He had been expecting to deal with someone caught short and relieved to have any offer. He had found someone who had made arrangements before the hard winter arrived, which meant she had been certain enough in November to commit, which meant she had known something he had not, which meant she was not the person he had ridden out here to find. He smiled his recalculating smile and left, and she watched the buggy until it was small on the road, and then went into the barn to check on her animals. There was the question of Westerfield. He had sold her a good pig at half price in December, and she had always known it was a better animal than the price reflected. When the Omaha deal was settled and the numbers were in the ledger and she understood what she had, she did not need to do what she did next. She went to Westerfield's farm on a cold morning in the third week of February with a small envelope and knocked on his door and told him she had done better than expected on the hog he had sold her, and she wanted to make up the difference to a fair price. Westerfield looked at the envelope for a long time. He said she didn't owe him that. She said she knew she didn't. She said she had figured fair price at $15, and he had taken $8. And so here was 7. He took it. He looked at her with a complicated expression that combined confusion and gratitude, and the particular discomfort of a man who has been treated better than he treated someone else. He said he hadn't thought the pumpkins would work. She said a lot of people hadn't. She did not say it with any edge at all, which was its own kind of grace. The drive to the railhead in Louisville was on a Thursday in late February, 5 of Alderman's men arriving with the trucks and the loading chutes and doing the work efficiently and without event. Clara watched her 10 animals load with the careful, private feeling of someone completing a thing they had promised themselves they would complete. Levins had come down again for the collection, and he stood beside her at the chute and told her Alderman wanted to know if she would be running Hogs again next season and whether the pumpkin supply could be reliably arranged. She said she had already spoken to Foote about his next frost-damaged lot and had a handshake agreement on it, and she was looking at acquiring 16 weanlings in the spring. Levins wrote something in his pocket ledger. He said Alderman could use a producer who could repeat this at scale. She said she was aware of that. He said he'd be in touch. She said she'd be here. Horalick came to her fence that evening while she was doing the last of the barn work, the lot empty now and swept, the winter's straw hauled out, and the floor showing clean plank. He stood at the gate in the last of the February light, which was thin and blue, and honest the way winter end light is honest, and he said nothing for a while, which was his way. Then he said, "Do you remember what I told you at the start?" She said she did. The land gives the thing it wants to give. He nodded. He looked at the empty lot and the clean barn and the yard where 4,700 frost-soft pumpkins had been stacked in October. He said, "The land gave you rotten pumpkins and a hard winter, and you were stubborn enough to find the gift in both." Clara wiped her hands on her work coat and looked at the empty lot and thought about that. Then she said, "I think the pumpkins were always the gift. The winter was just proof." Horalick made a small sound that was the closest he came to laughter, and went back up to his ridge in the last blue light, and Clara went in and sat at the stove with her ledger, and wrote the final numbers in a clean line, and closed the book, and set it on the shelf above the stove, and listened to the quiet farm around her, which was a different quiet from the one she had inherited, fuller somehow, and more her own. The spring that followed was early and soft, the way springs come after hard winters, as if the earth is sorry for what it put you through. Horalick's ridge went green by April. The Platte came up clean and running. In May, Clara Marsh purchased 16 Duroc weanlings from the Louisville auction with the proceeds of the Omaha sale, paid in cash from the Weeping Water Bank, and brought them home in 2 loads in a wagon she rented at a fair price, and drove herself. She had written to Foote in March and confirmed the pumpkin arrangement, his first and second frost lots, at $12 for the season, which was more than 10 but fair to them both, and he had agreed with the air of a man who has concluded he was dealing with someone who would be worth dealing with for a long time. She stacked new bedding in the south side lot. She repaired the water trough fitting that had given her trouble in December. She wrote to Alderman's man Levins in Omaha and told him she was running 16 this year and expected to be ready for a February collection again if he wanted to put it in his book, and he wrote back promptly and said he did. She began the new ledger. Ida Prewitt stopped her outside the post office in May. Same post office, same tilt of the head, and told her she was glad to hear things had gone so well. Clara thanked her. She was not unkind about it. The town's embarrassment was not a debt she needed collecting. Harold Buell, who had a difficult spring because a difficult winter had left him with less capital to work with than he'd planned, tipped his hat to her at the grain elevator and said something about the wisdom of diversifying one's feeds, and she agreed pleasantly and bought her August corn at the low and went home. The young men at the co-op had stopped talking about Marsh's pumpkin palace, which she noted not with satisfaction, but simply with the recognition that the world had moved on, as the world does when it finds it was wrong about something, preferring to arrive at what comes next rather than remain at what it said before. One June morning, a boy of about 12 appeared at her gate. His name was Emile, and he was the second son of a family that had come that spring from further east with not much and settled on a parched quarter section near Horalek's Ridge. He had, Horalek had told her, a feeling for animals that his family didn't know what to do with and nowhere to put it. Clara hired him for the summer at 50 cents a week to help with feeding and lot work, and he was better with the animals than she had hoped. He named every one of the 16 hogs within the first week and could distinguish them by movement alone from 20 feet, and she had to admit this was useful. He was earnest and quiet and worked with the focused attention of a child who has found the place where they make sense. She paid him his 50 cents each week without fail, and at the end of the summer she paid him an extra $1 for the season-end lot clean and told him he was welcome back in the fall. The autumn came with the first frost, and the frost-soft pumpkins came with it, and Clara went to Foot's farm with $12 in a flour sack and 2 borrowed wagons and hauled them home herself, the orange mounds luminous in the afternoon light, and she stacked them in long rows against the windward fence and covered them with canvas, and the year turned, and the work continued, and the land gave what it wanted to give, and she was there to take it, standing in her barn before dawn with a lamp and a feed bucket, and the particular kind of quiet confidence that comes not from certainty about the future, but from having once been cold enough and stubborn enough and observant enough to find a fortune in 4,700 things the rest of the world had already thrown away. She had learned it from Iowa and from her father's hard land, and from a 71-year-old Czech farmer who spoke in the patient rhythms of someone who has watched many things grow and many things fail, and knows the difference is mostly time and attention. The land gives the thing it wants to give, he had said, not the thing you wish it would. What Clara Marsh had done, what the town of Cass County eventually and somewhat reluctantly admitted she had done, was stop arguing with the land about what it ought to produce and start listening to what it was already offering. The frost came every year. The pumpkins went soft every year. The roadside stands had been plowing them under for a generation, losing them to the November mud without a second thought, because the value they carried was not the value anyone had thought to look for. It took a young woman alone on a failing farm with $6.50 in the bank and a winter coming hard to look at 4,700 ruined pumpkins and see, not a disaster, not a fool's bargain, not an embarrassment, but exactly and precisely enough.